They showed up at my door at 6:55 in the morning, 3 days after my grandfather's burial. Two men wearing matching navy polo shirts with Red Mesa Community Security stitched over the chest stood on my porch like they owned it. One of them handed me a citation for $2,700 because a rental pickup truck had been parked overnight in my own driveway. I had flown in from Tacoma to put the man who raised me into the ground. I hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, and these strangers were calmly informing me that I'd violated neighborhood parking rules on land my family had possessed decades before their subdivision existed. When I asked which rule I'd broken, the taller one smiled and said the board didn't appreciate newcomers who refused to learn how things were done. He called me ma'am like it was an insult. He had no idea I was a land use attorney. He didn't know my grandfather left me more than a house, and he definitely didn't know what was already in motion. My name is Elena Whitaker. I'm 36 years old, and until the previous week, I hadn't been back in southern Arizona for almost 16 years. I left after law school and built a career in environmental and property litigation that carried me from Eugene to Spokane, then back to Eugene again. My grandfather, Walter Whitaker, never tried to stop me. He told me to build something that was mine, not live inside his shadow. But he made me promise one thing, that if he ever called and said it was time, I'd come home. 3 weeks earlier, he called to say the cancer had spread everywhere and there was nothing left to try. I booked the first flight. I spent 5 days holding his hand in hospice. I buried him beside my grandmother on family land. And now I was standing barefoot in his kitchen, clutching a citation from people who didn't understand where they were standing. The house sits on a low ridge at the western edge of what used to be Whitaker Range, roughly 92 acres my great-grandfather claimed in 1919. From the porch, you could see the subdivision stretching east toward the hills, rows of identical stucco homes with clay tile roofs and gravel yards laid out along winding streets with names like Coyote Crest and Mesa Blossom Drive. Red Mesa Estates went up in the late 80s, ballooned in the 90s, and now housed close to 1,300 residents who believed they owned everything beneath their feet. Growing up, it was just the neighborhood next door. That morning, watching the security SUV roll back toward the guarded entrance, I started wondering what exactly my grandfather had really left me. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The woman on the line introduced herself as Marjorie Klein, president of the Red Mesa Estates Homeowners Association. Her voice was warm in that polished, practiced way that never quite reaches sincerity. She offered condolences for my grandfather's passing, mentioned how he'd been part of the landscape for years, then shifted gears without pausing for breath. The board, she said, had concerns about the appearance of my property and its effect on community values. She suggested a fast, generous purchase that would let me return to Oregon without the burden of managing a property from afar. I stood at the kitchen window, staring at identical rooftops, and told her I wasn't selling. The friendliness vanished. She explained that properties bordering the community were expected to maintain certain standards. My grandfather, she said, had always understood that. I asked what would happen if I didn't. The silence lasted long enough to be deliberate. Life here can get uncomfortable for people who don't cooperate, she said. Then she hung up. I spent the rest of the day sorting through my grandfather's belongings, packing clothes for donation, trying to impose order on grief. Near sunset, when the sky outside burned orange and violet, I opened the filing cabinet in his study. Walter kept records like a habit: tax returns, water rights, assessments going back 4 decades. But 3 folders at the bottom drawer stopped me. One was labeled Red Mesa Ground Lease, another Whitaker Family Trust Land Holdings. The third, thicker than the others, read Annual Receipts. The lease was dated 1987, a 50-year agreement between my grandfather and Red Mesa Development Group, granting use of approximately 1,100 acres of Whitaker land for residential construction. In exchange, the developer would pay $135,000 per year, indexed to inflation. When the developer folded in 2006, the obligation transferred to the Homeowners Association. Payments had continued uninterrupted, every year deposited into a trust account I'd never been told existed. I turned to the survey map on the wall. The boundary lines were unmistakable. Whitaker land ran from the foothills to the county road, from the wash in the north to the old state highway in the south.
Red Mesa Estates, every house, every road, sat entirely inside it. The lease expired in 2037, and in Section 11, highlighted in my grandfather's hand, was a clause that made my pulse jump. In the event of material breach, including unauthorized construction, failure to maintain standards, or interference with adjacent land, landlord may terminate with 90 days written notice. I sat back in his chair, staring at the subdivision lights blinking on in the dark. Marjorie Klein had threatened me that morning. She didn't know she'd just handed me leverage. I met Rosa Delgado the next morning at the mailbox. She lived in a small adobe house down the county road, one of the last original properties untouched by the subdivision. She was 74, barely 5 feet tall, silver hair in a tight knot, eyes sharp with memory. She'd known my grandfather for decades and watched Red Mesa rise from scrubland into sprawl. Over coffee in her kitchen, she told me how it started. Citations for fences an inch too high, complaints about wind chimes, letters claiming her home lowered values. Her husband had died the year the pressure began. Then Marjorie showed up with an offer, 35% below market, calling it the best she could hope for. Rosa told her exactly where to go. But not everyone held. She named families who left one by one after the same pattern of harassment. Most of their homes were now rentals owned by Marjorie Klein Limited, registered to Marjorie's husband. I asked Rosa if she knew the HOA paid rent for the land. She stared at me. I explained the lease, the payments, the fact that no homeowner actually owned the ground. Her eyes widened when she did the math. Millions of dollars over decades, hidden. Nearly 500 families living on land they didn't own never told the truth. Rosa leaned back, quiet. Then she asked what I was going to do. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing. My grandfather hadn't kept those records by accident, and Marjorie Klein had just made the first move on land she never owned.
That afternoon, after Rosa left, I sat alone in my grandfather's study and read the lease again from top to bottom, not skimming, not assuming. Every clause, every cross-reference, every footnote. The language was dry, precise, and brutal in how little room it left for interpretation. Red Mesa Estates did not exist independently. It existed by permission that could be revoked. The land was mine, legally, cleanly, without ambiguity. And for nearly 2 decades, the HOA had operated as if that fact were a rumor rather than a recorded reality. I understood then why my grandfather had never been touched, why the harassment Rosa described had skipped his house like water around stone. They hadn't spared him out of kindness, they'd spared him out of fear. The phone rang just after noon. This time, it was an automated message from the HOA compliance office notifying me of a second violation. My rental truck had been observed overnight again. The fine was $1,100, due within 10 days. I wrote the time down, took screenshots, and added it to a growing folder on my laptop labeled Interference. By sunset, there were 4 separate notices sitting in my email, each slightly reworded, each escalating in tone. They weren't trying to correct behavior, they were building a paper trail. I recognized the tactic immediately. Create enough evidence to paint the target as the problem, then squeeze. The next morning, I drove into Phoenix to meet Daniel Mercer, a real estate attorney recommended by a former colleague. His office sat on the 13th floor of a glass tower overlooking the sprawl of the valley. He was 49, broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone who'd once been athletic and now carried authority instead. I unloaded 2 banker's boxes onto his conference table and said nothing while he read. It took him nearly an hour. When he finished, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. He told me in 23 years of practice, he'd never seen a master-planned community sitting on a ground lease its residents didn't know about. He explained the doctrine that governed it. Improvements follow the land. When the lease ends, everything reverts. Homes, roads, utilities, all of it. I asked him about the homeowners. Daniel pulled up archived purchase contracts from the original developer. Leasehold interest, buried disclosure, page 46. The buyers technically owned their structures, not the soil. The clock beneath them was ticking, whether they knew it or not. Then we went through violations, unauthorized expansion of the community center beyond the original footprint, commercial use of shared facilities prohibited under Section 8, governance changes never disclosed to the landowner. Each one alone was arguable. Together, they were a pattern, a sustained breach. Daniel said my grandfather could have terminated years ago. I told him I thought he'd been waiting for someone who would know how to use it. On the drive back, my phone buzzed again. An HOA community alert email had gone out. Rosa forwarded it to me within minutes. It didn't name me, but it didn't have to. It warned residents about a recently arrived adjacent property owner displaying hostile behavior and disregard for standards, urging vigilance and reporting. The language was careful, suggestive, designed to turn neighbors into informants. By evening, screenshots from the private community forum began arriving, anonymous posts speculating about my intentions. Someone suggested I was trying to devalue nearby homes. Another hinted at criminal activity because of how often my truck was cited. Likes piled up quickly. The narrative was forming. 2 days later, Mark Klein appeared at my gate. He drove a silver luxury SUV that looked out of place on a dusty county road. He didn't introduce himself. He assumed recognition. He spoke calmly, professionally, offering to resolve things amicably. He slid an envelope across the hood of my truck. Inside was an offer for $395,000 cash, 30-day close. He framed it as a favor, a way out before things got unpleasant. I asked him what the property had been appraised for 2 years earlier. His smile twitched. I told him it was $710,000. I told him his offer was less than 60% of that, and I told him I wasn't interested in selling to someone whose business model depended on pressure. His tone changed. He warned me about zoning boards, county offices, people I'd never met. He almost said the land wasn't worth much without finishing the sentence. He didn't need to. I already knew he knew. That night, I called Daniel and asked him to prepare formal notice of lease violations, but not send it yet. He agreed and told me the documentation was nearly airtight. Satellite imagery, financial records, timelines. He suggested filing a complaint with the state attorney general for non-disclosure and potential consumer fraud. I agreed. The following morning, county code enforcement showed up responding to an anonymous complaint about unsecured property. The fence hadn't been touched yet, but the complaint existed, filed at 7:12 a.m. I wrote that down too. The fence was cut at 2:18 a.m. 2 nights later. Motion alerts woke me. The footage showed a hooded figure using bolt cutters along the eastern boundary, 3 panels severed cleanly. I called the sheriff. A report was filed. No suspect identified. By noon, another code complaint had been lodged citing safety hazards from damaged fencing. The efficiency was impressive. Daniel called it coordinated interference, a direct breach. He sent formal notice that afternoon, citing Section 11, 30 days to cure. Rosa came by that evening with food and quiet concern. She told me I could end it all immediately, terminate the lease, take everything back. I told her I wouldn't. Nearly 500 families lived there. None of them had voted for intimidation. None of them knew they were tenants. Punishing them would make me no better than the people causing the harm. Rosa said my grandfather would agree. He'd waited because burning everything down was easy. Doing it right wasn't. The emergency HOA meeting notice arrived the next day, hand-delivered by security. Agenda: authorization to pursue legal action against a non-compliant adjacent property owner. The meeting would be held at the community center. The very structure expanded onto my land without permission. Daniel prepared everything. I slept better than I had since the funeral. I knew what I had, I knew what was coming, and I knew they were about to make mistakes in public. When Saturday came, the parking lot was nearly full. I walked in carrying my laptop and documents, ignored the stairs, and took a seat near the back. Marjorie Klein called the meeting to order with practiced confidence and framed the issue exactly as expected: an outsider, a threat. I raised my hand and cited statute. 2 minutes, reluctantly granted. I walked to the front, connected the projector, and began with the lease. The room shifted. Then the map. Voices rose. Then the payment records. Silence. When I explained the violations and the termination clause, no one interrupted. I wasn't threatening. I was informing. The meeting collapsed into chaos. Questions flew. Board members froze. Marjorie tried to regain control and failed. Mark pulled her toward the exit. People followed me outside afterwards, demanding copies, demanding answers. I gave them what I could. Rosa stood beside me, smiling for the first time in years. She said the truth had weight. It changed how people stood. Driving home through streets I legally owned, I understood something finally. Power didn't announce itself. It waited, and the people who abused it always assumed it belonged to them until the ground shifted underneath them.
The retaliation accelerated immediately after the emergency meeting unraveled. Within 48 hours, the HOA board convened a closed-door session with no public notice and no distributed agenda. I didn't hear about it directly. Rosa called me just after sunset, her voice low and tight, and told me one of her neighbors inside the subdivision had tipped her off. The vote, she said, was 4-1 in favor of challenging the validity of the land lease itself. The single dissenting vote came from a board member named Janice Holloway, who reportedly asked why homeowners had never been informed about the lease in the first place. By the next morning, Janice was removed from the board for what the HOA described as conduct inconsistent with community leadership. The speed was surgical. Silence the question, erase the dissenter, move on. 3 days later, a process server appeared at my door with a thick envelope. The HOA had filed suit in county court alleging fraudulent misrepresentation of property rights and seeking a declaratory judgment that the ground lease was void due to procedural defects dating back to the original execution. 43 pages of legal language arguing that my grandfather, who'd held clear title since before the subdivision existed, somehow lacked authority to lease land he indisputably owned. Daniel reviewed it within hours and called it baseless. But baseless didn't mean harmless. It meant expensive. It meant time. It meant exactly what they wanted, pressure. That same evening, I found an unmarked white envelope in my mailbox, no return address. Inside was a single sentence spelled out in block letters cut from magazines. Leave now. This is your warning. I photographed it, sealed it, and called the sheriff. The deputy who took my statement was polite and honest. Anonymous threats without identifiers rarely went anywhere. Still, a report was filed. The letter joined the growing archive of evidence. That night, I installed additional cameras around the property and slept lightly. At 2:41 a.m., motion alerts jolted me awake again. The camera feed showed a figure along the southern fence line, moving deliberately, cutting through wire with practiced ease. By the time I reached the window, the person was gone. The damage wasn't random. It was enough to create a vehicle-sized opening. The sheriff returned, documented it, and said what everyone says when they can't prove intent. Could be vandalism. Could be kids. We both knew better. By noon the next day, county code enforcement arrived in response to an anonymous complaint about unsecured fencing posing a safety hazard. The inspector, a man named Collins, walked the perimeter, noted the damage, and asked how long it had been like that. I showed him the sheriff's report timestamped 8 hours earlier. He nodded, wrote something down, and told me I had 30 days to repair it or face fines. The complaint had been filed at 7:06 a.m., less than 5 hours after the fence was cut. Someone had been watching the clock. Daniel called it coordinated interference and invoked Section 11 of the lease in his formal notice. Harassment, vandalism, threats, and misuse of regulatory systems all constituted breach. The HOA had 30 days to cure. He also escalated the matter to the state attorney general's office, citing failure to disclose material information to homeowners and potential consumer fraud. That step mattered. It meant subpoenas. It meant records they couldn't bury. Rosa came by that evening with food and quiet resolve. We sat on the porch as the lights of the subdivision flickered on below us. She said again that I could end everything by terminating the lease. Take the land back, let them scatter. I told her again that I wouldn't. Nearly 500 families lived there. They hadn't written the threats. They hadn't cut the fence. They were just now learning the truth about where they lived. Burning their lives down would be easy. Holding the right people accountable would take longer. Rosa nodded and said my grandfather had always believed the hard way was usually the right one. The annual HOA meeting notice arrived 2 days later. Unlike the emergency session, this one required public notice and open attendance, board elections, budget approvals, mandatory quorum. Daniel smiled when he saw it. He said this was where everything would come into the light, whether they wanted it to or not. Over the next week, we prepared meticulously. Financial records obtained through the Attorney General's office began arriving. Contractor invoices that didn't correspond to real businesses, administrative expenses without documentation, patterns that repeated year after year. Daniel built timelines. I reviewed everything twice. The morning of the meeting, the community center parking lot overflowed. Cars lined the street. People stood in clusters, talking in low voices. Rumors had spread. The lawsuit, the board removal, the threats. Inside, over 200 residents packed the hall. Marjorie stood at the podium, looking composed, but her shoulders were rigid, her smile brittle. A representative from the Attorney General's office sat in the back, quiet and observant. Marjorie moved quickly through routine items, trying to control time. When she reached elections, I raised my hand and requested to address the membership.
She refused at first, citing prior disruptions. A man near the front stood and said he wanted to hear it. Others agreed. The pressure mounted. She relented and granted 5 minutes. I walked to the front and connected my laptop. I didn't start with emotion, I started with numbers. Annual HOA revenue, lease payments, operational costs. Then I showed what remained, funds that couldn't be accounted for. The room shifted. I clicked to property records, homes acquired by an LLC registered to Marjorie's husband. Purchase dates aligning with harassment campaigns, citation clusters, sales below market. The pattern was undeniable. When Marjorie grabbed the microphone and called it defamation, voices shouted back asking for explanations. She lost control of the room. Her husband stood to leave, but the state representative stopped him. The mask slipped completely then. She shouted about building the community, about ownership, about outsiders. And in that moment, everyone saw it. She didn't see residents, she saw assets. A motion for no confidence was called from the floor and seconded immediately. The vote was overwhelming. In less than 15 minutes, 14 years of control ended. Deputies escorted Marjorie's husband out. The board sat frozen as residents demanded audits and explanations. I answered questions until my voice gave out. The consequences unfolded over the next 3 months. The Attorney General's investigation confirmed systematic fraud, falsified invoices, undisclosed revenues, and misuse of authority. Charges followed: restitution orders, probation, permanent bans from HOA governance. Properties acquired through harassment were sold at fair value, with proceeds returned. Families who'd been pushed out received checks that closed old wounds. The lease was renegotiated, not terminated, a 25-year extension with full transparency, independent audits, and resident oversight. Fees dropped when the fraud ended. New board members were elected. Rosa was among them. So was Janice, reinstated after being removed for asking the wrong question. 6 months later, I opened the date between my grandfather's land and the subdivision. A walking path cut through the desert scrub, connecting what had been divided. Families walked it at sunset. Children ran ahead. Adults lingered. I stood on the ridge and watched lights glow across land held for a century. Power, I learned, isn't about fear. It's about responsibility. My grandfather knew that, and now, finally, so did I.
The legal fallout didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, document by document, notice by notice, each one tightening the noose the board had spent years weaving for other people. Within a week of the annual meeting, residents began receiving certified letters from the Attorney General's office requesting voluntary interviews. Some were confused, some were angry. Most were relieved that someone with actual authority was finally asking questions out loud. Marjorie Quine stopped appearing in public altogether. Her car vanished from the community center lot. Her name disappeared from HOA email headers, replaced by bland committee signatures that didn't fool anyone. Control had slipped and everyone could feel it. Daniel warned me not to mistake silence for surrender. People who build systems around intimidation don't walk away cleanly when the spotlight turns on. They lash out where they think it still hurts. He was right. 2 days after the AG notices went out, the lawsuit escalated. The HOA amended its complaint, adding allegations that I was intentionally destabilizing the community to coerce renegotiation of the lease under duress. It was almost impressive how quickly they inverted reality. Daniel filed a response that same afternoon, attaching sworn statements, timestamps, and a summary of retaliatory actions that read like a checklist of misconduct. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing for 9 weeks out, enough time for panic to ferment. Residents began coming to my property in small groups. At first, they stayed near the gate, unsure whether they were welcome. I invited them in. I showed them the maps, the lease, the payment records. I answered the same questions over and over. Did we really not own the land? Why weren't we told? What happens in 10 years? I told them the truth every time. You own your homes. The lease governs the ground. It expires in 2037 unless extended. No one is being evicted. Nothing changes overnight. The relief was visible. So was the anger, directed not at me, but at the people who'd lied to them for years. The community forum shifted tone almost instantly. Posts that once hinted at suspicion turned into demands for transparency. Someone uploaded copies of their original purchase contract and circled the buried lease disclosure. Others followed. The realization spread fast. People don't like being treated like children, especially when money is involved. And now they knew their fees had been paying rent they were never told about. Marjorie resurfaced exactly once. She showed up unannounced at my gate late one afternoon, sunglasses on, posture rigid. She didn't apologize. She didn't threaten. She said the community was in chaos and implied it was my fault. She suggested mediation, private discussion, a way to settle everything quietly. I told her she had 20 years to be transparent and chose secrecy instead. I told her any communication would go through counsel. Her jaw tightened. She said I didn't understand the consequences of humiliating people like her. I told her she didn't understand the consequences of lying to 500 families. She left without another word. The sheriff returned the following week. This time, it wasn't about vandalism. It was about the anonymous letter. Forensic analysis tied the magazine cutouts to a printer model registered to an office supply account used by the HOA. Not definitive, but enough to add weight, enough to show pattern. Daniel added it to the growing evidentiary pile. The preliminary hearing arrived faster than expected. The courtroom was packed. Residents filled the benches behind me. Marjorie and her husband sat on the opposite side, flanked by attorneys who looked increasingly uncomfortable as exhibits were introduced. The judge didn't rule that day. He didn't have to. He denied the HOA's request for an injunction and warned counsel about advancing arguments unsupported by fact. It was a small procedural win, but the message was clear. The lease wasn't going away. 2 weeks later, the AG's office executed subpoenas, bank records, vendor contracts, internal communications. The board's interim leadership tried to cooperate, but the damage was already done. Emails surfaced discussing pressure strategies, spreadsheets tracking properties targeted for acquisition, notes referencing compliance fatigue. It wasn't just unethical, it was systematic. Residents called an emergency membership meeting without board initiation, something that had never happened before. The room was full again, but the energy was different. There was no stage-managed narrative this time. People spoke freely. Some cried, some shouted. A few apologized to me personally for believing the emails. I told them it didn't matter. What mattered was what they did next. They voted to suspend all non-essential spending pending audit results. They voted to cap board authority temporarily. They voted to require full disclosure of all lease-related payments going forward. These were people who a month earlier had trusted blindly. Now they demanded proof. Watching it happen felt surreal. The charges came quietly. No press conference, just filings. Marjorie was charged with fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Her husband faced accessory charges and vandalism counts tied to the fence damage. Restitution amounts were calculated down to the dollar. Properties acquired through harassment were flagged for divestment. The legal process ground forward with the inevitability of gravity. Through it all, I kept repairing what had been damaged. The fence was rebuilt stronger than before. The cameras stayed. The evidence folder grew thinner as matters resolved. Rosa stopped by often, sometimes just to sit. She said the road felt lighter, like something heavy had been lifted. When the plea agreements were finalized, there was no celebration, just a collective exhale. Marjorie avoided jail, but lost everything she'd used to wield power: probation, restitution, a lifetime ban from HOA leadership. Her husband paid fines and surrendered properties. Families who'd been pushed out received compensation. It didn't undo the years they'd lost, but it acknowledged the harm. The lease extension vote happened on a clear Saturday morning. 94% approval, transparent terms, annual audits, resident oversight. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, I'd learned, was disruptive only to people who depended on lies. That evening, I walked the path we'd cleared between my grandfather's land and the subdivision. People were already using it. Joggers, parents with strollers, a teenager walking a dog. No gates, no signs, just land, open and shared. I stood there until the sun dropped behind the hills and the lights came on, one by one. The community looked the same from a distance. Rows of houses, quiet streets. But underneath, everything had changed. Fear had lost its grip. Information had replaced rumor. And a place built on borrowed ground finally understood what it stood on.
The aftermath didn't feel like victory. It felt like cleanup. Weeks passed where nothing dramatic happened, and that was how I knew things were finally moving in the right direction. No surprise notices taped to my gate. No anonymous complaints logged before sunrise. No HOA emails dripping with implication. Instead, there were forms, interviews, affidavits, and long, quiet stretches where the only sounds at night were insects and wind moving through desert brush. Power, once exposed, doesn't explode. It leaks out slowly, leaving behind a mess that has to be dealt with piece by piece. The Attorney General's investigation widened. What began as a review of non-disclosure turned into a full forensic audit of HOA finances going back 12 years. Residents were asked to submit records of fines, citations, and forced repairs. Dozens did. Patterns emerged fast. The same names appeared again and again on violation notices. The same properties received escalating penalties within narrow time windows. The same contractors were paid for consulting services that no one could describe. Daniel said it was one of the cleanest abuse of authority cases he'd ever seen because the perpetrators had grown careless. They never expected scrutiny. I spent most mornings at my grandfather's desk answering emails from residents. Some were angry, some were embarrassed. A few were defensive, still clinging to the belief that leadership had acted in their best interest. I answered all of them the same way, with documents, with dates, with receipts. Facts don't argue. They sit there and wait until people are ready to look. Eventually, most people are. One afternoon, a couple in their late 60s came to see me. They'd lived in the subdivision since 1994, raised children there, paid every fee without complaint. They brought a binder with every citation they'd ever received, neatly organized, and asked me to help them understand why they'd been targeted after refusing to support a board assessment years earlier. The timeline matched perfectly. Seeing it click for them was painful. They hadn't done anything wrong. They'd just been inconvenient. As more residents compared notes, a shared realization settled in. The HOA hadn't been enforcing standards, it had been enforcing obedience. Once that idea took hold, loyalty evaporated. Attendance at the interim board meetings tripled. People asked questions they'd never dared ask before. Why was this vendor chosen? Why was that fine issued? Who approved this expenditure? Transparency, once demanded, is hard to roll back. Marjorie Klein's name stopped coming up entirely, not because she'd been forgiven, but because she'd become irrelevant. Her plea agreement was finalized quietly. 36 months probation, $165,000 restitution, mandatory ethics training, and permanent removal from any fiduciary role involving homeowner associations in the state. Her husband accepted a separate deal: probation, fines, and the forced sale of properties acquired through harassment. The fence damage charge stuck, so did the false reporting. It wasn't prison, but it was the end of their leverage. The divestment process was messy. 8 homes had to be sold at fair market value, not the discounted prices they'd been taken for. In some cases, the original owners were gone. Heirs had to be located. Trusts had to be unwound. One family had moved overseas and hadn't expected to ever hear from Red Mesa again. When the checks went out, no one celebrated, but something eased. Old anger finally had an endpoint. Rosa was elected to the new board without opposition. So was Janice, reinstated by member vote after being removed for asking questions. The rest of the board filled out with people who'd never held power before and looked slightly uncomfortable doing so. That was fine by me. Discomfort keeps people honest. The renegotiated lease took effect the following quarter. Same annual payment amount, 25-year extension, full disclosure language baked directly into HOA governing documents, annual independent audits, resident access to all financial statements, and any future amendment required a supermajority vote. Daniel said it was one of the cleanest lease revisions he'd ever drafted because everyone at the table understood the stakes. No one wanted ambiguity ever again. With the legal pressure easing, something unexpected happened. People started showing up not to ask questions, but to help. A retired contractor volunteered to fix trail erosion along the new walking path. A group of teenagers organized a cleanup day along the boundary road. Someone planted shade trees near the fence line. The gate my grandfather had kept locked for decades stayed open. It didn't need to be guarded anymore. One evening, Rosa and I sat on my porch watching the lights come on across the subdivision. She told me she'd lived her whole adult life assuming that people like Marjorie always won in the end, that bullies with paperwork were worse than bullies with fists because they never got caught. Seeing accountability, she said, had changed something fundamental in how she saw the world. I didn't respond right away. I was thinking about my grandfather, about the fact that he'd known all of this for years and chosen patience over force. The court dismissed the HOA's lawsuit with prejudice shortly after the plea agreements were entered. The Orge's judge's order was brief and sharp. Claims unsupported by fact. Abuse of process. No refiling permitted. Daniel framed it and handed it to me like a trophy. I thanked him and put it back in the file. Closure didn't need decoration. The county removed the last code complaint from my property record a week later. The inspector who'd written the initial notice stopped by unexpectedly, this time without a clipboard. He apologized. Not formally, just a quiet acknowledgement that he'd been used. I accepted it. Systems correct slowly, but they do correct. By late summer, Red Mesa felt different. Not quieter, just steadier. HOA meetings were longer now, but calmer. People listened. Arguments happened, but they were about landscaping budgets and pool hours, not whispered threats and anonymous reports. Fear had been replaced with friction, and friction was manageable. I took a long walk one evening along the trail as the sun dipped low, painting the mountains copper and purple. Families passed me without hesitation. A woman waved. A kid asked if the path went all the way to the wash. It did. For the first time since returning, I didn't feel like an outsider defending a border. I felt like a steward doing maintenance. Standing at the ridge, I understood something my grandfather never said out loud. He hadn't held the land because he wanted control. He'd held it because ownership created responsibility. Someone had to be in a position to stop things when they went too far. He'd waited until there was someone who would use that position carefully. Red Mesa Estates still existed, homes still stood, lives continued uninterrupted, but the structure beneath it all had changed. Lies had been stripped away, authority had been redistributed, and the ground everyone stood on, both literal and legal, was finally solid. I locked the house that night and left the gate open, exactly the way my grandfather never had.
The quiet that followed felt earned, but it wasn't empty. It was full of consequences settling into place. By early fall, the Attorney General's office had closed its investigation with a formal report that circulated through the community like a final verdict. It laid everything out in plain language: how funds had been diverted, how disclosure had been intentionally obscured, how enforcement mechanisms had been weaponized to pressure residents into compliance or exit. People printed it, people highlighted it, people talked about it at kitchen tables and on evening walks. Once something like that is written down by an authority that can't be ignored, it becomes permanent. No amount of spin can erase it. The interim board scheduled listening sessions instead of meetings. No motions, no votes, just microphones and time. I attended a few, always sitting in the back. Residents stood up and told stories they'd never shared publicly. Being fined weeks after disagreeing with a board proposal, being warned that continued non-cooperation could affect resale value, being isolated after questioning a budget line item. None of it sounded dramatic on its own. Together, it formed a picture that was impossible to dismiss. Control had been exerted quietly, consistently, and with intent. Daniel told me this was the part most people never see: the social reckoning after the legal one. Courts can punish misconduct. They can't repair trust. That had to happen person by person. And it was happening. Slowly, unevenly, but it was happening. I stayed busy finalizing the lease extension details and responding to inevitable follow-up questions. What if the land was sold someday? It couldn't be without community notice and approval. What if the lease terms changed again? They couldn't without a supermajority vote. What if someone like Marjorie tried to come back through a proxy? The restrictions were explicit. Her ban wasn't symbolic, it was enforceable. Knowing that mattered to people who'd lived under her authority for over a decade. One morning, I received an email from a man who'd moved away 4 years earlier after selling under pressure. He'd just learned about the investigation and wanted to know if it was too late to recover anything. Daniel took the call. The answer was complicated. Statutes of limitation mattered. Evidence mattered. But sometimes restitution funds covered cases like his. A week later, he emailed again to say he'd been approved for partial compensation. It wasn't everything, but it was acknowledgement. That alone, he said, was worth more than the money. Rosa adjusted quickly to her new role on the board. She didn't grandstand, she didn't lecture, she asked questions that forced other people to think. Why was this necessary? Who benefits? Where's the documentation? It was refreshing and uncomfortable in equal measure. Meetings ran longer, agendas grew thicker, but nothing slipped through unnoticed anymore. The community center, once the site of whispered deals and selective enforcement, became neutral ground. The new board voted to rename it after a resident poll. The winning choice honored my grandfather's family, something I hadn't suggested and wouldn't have requested. When they asked my permission, I hesitated. It felt strange to have his name attached to a place that had once been used to hurt people. Rosa said that was exactly why it mattered. The vote passed with overwhelming support. The walking trail became part of daily life faster than I expected. Early mornings brought runners. Late afternoons brought families. It connected two places that had coexisted for decades without touching. I realized then how physical barriers reinforce psychological ones. Remove the gate and people behave differently. Suspicion dissolves when paths overlap. Not everything was smooth. A few residents still resented me, quietly or openly. Some believed the community should never have been challenged, regardless of what leadership had done. I understood that instinct. Change is threatening even when it's justified. I didn't try to win them over. Time would do that better than arguments ever could. The first annual audit under the new lease was released in November. Clean, boring, exactly what it was supposed to be. Fees dropped another small percentage. Maintenance schedules were published in advance. Board members rotated committee assignments. It all felt almost mundane, which was the point. One afternoon, I walked the boundary road with Rosa. She pointed out houses that once belonged to families who'd been forced out.
She told me where they'd ended up when she knew. Some had done well, some hadn't. But now at least their departures had context. History doesn't change outcomes, but it changes meaning. As winter approached, I had to decide what to do next. My career waited back in Oregon. Clients, cases, a life I'd put on hold. I'd always planned to leave once my grandfather's affairs were settled. Now, leaving felt different. The work here wasn't unfinished, but it was ongoing. Stewardship doesn't end cleanly, it just becomes less visible. I talked it through with Daniel. He reminded me that structures matter more than presence. The lease was secure, the oversight mechanisms were in place, the community had learned how to question authority. That knowledge wouldn't disappear when I did. He was right, staying forever wasn't the point. Making sure things could function without me was. The night before I booked my return flight, I walked the trail one last time alone. The desert was quiet. The kind of quiet that exists only when people feel safe enough not to fill it. I thought about my grandfather's patience, about how he'd endured knowing what he could do, choosing instead to wait for the right moment. Power unused is often misunderstood. It looks like weakness from the outside. From the inside, it feels like restraint. When I locked the house that night, I didn't feel like I was abandoning anything. I felt like I was leaving something stable behind. The gate stayed open. It always would. The land would remain. The lease would run. The community would argue, disagree, compromise, and move forward like any other group of people learning how to govern themselves without fear. That was enough. I drove out before sunrise, the road empty ahead of me, the subdivision lights fading in the rearview mirror. For the first time since returning, I wasn't leaving because I'd been pushed. I was leaving because the ground no longer needed defending.
Leaving Arizona didn't feel like an ending so much as a pause that finally made sense. Back in Oregon, my work resumed almost immediately. Briefs, hearings, deadlines stacking the way they always had. But something in me had shifted. I noticed it in the way I listened to clients, in how little patience I now had for people who tried to blur responsibility behind procedure. Red Mesa stayed with me, not as unfinished business, but as proof that systems could be forced to correct themselves if someone was willing to hold the line long enough. I checked in weekly at first, then less often as the new board found its rhythm and stopped needing reassurance that they were doing things right. They were. The first real test came in early spring when a developer approached the board with a proposal to add a small commercial strip along the eastern edge of the subdivision. Under the old regime, it would have sailed through quietly. This time, it didn't. Residents asked for environmental impact statements, traffic studies, financial disclosures. They asked how it aligned with the lease terms. They asked who benefited and who bore the cost. The proposal stalled, then died, not because development was evil, but because no one was willing to accept vagueness anymore. Rosa told me afterward that it was the first time she'd seen people exercise skepticism without fear. That mattered more than the outcome. The walking trail expanded gradually. What started as a narrow path became a maintained loop with signage and benches. None of it was flashy, all of it was deliberate. The gate remained open, not as a symbol, but as a fact of daily life. Kids biked through it, seniors walked it in the evenings. The line between inside and outside softened until it barely registered. Boundaries didn't disappear, they just stopped being weaponized. The final restitution checks went out that summer. Not everyone could be found, not every wound could be balanced with a number, but enough people received acknowledgement that the story of Red Mesa changed permanently. It was no longer just a cautionary tale about HOA abuse. It became an example of what happened when information surfaced and people refused to look away. That reputation spread quietly. Other communities reached out to the new board asking how they'd done it. Rosa shared templates, policies, mistakes to avoid. She told me she never thought she'd be advising anyone on governance. She said she felt like she was finally using everything she'd learned by surviving. Marjorie Klein never contacted me again. Once, months later, I heard she'd moved out of state. Another time, someone mentioned seeing her name in a minor court filing unrelated to housing. It didn't matter. Her absence was complete in the only way that counted. The system she'd built to amplify herself no longer existed. Power without structure collapses quickly. The lease extension held firm. Annual audits came back clean. The community voted down a proposal to raise fees without a detailed breakdown. That vote wasn't dramatic, it was calm, informed, predictable, exactly what governance is supposed to look like when fear isn't doing the work. I returned to Arizona once more that year for a hearing unrelated to Red Mesa and took a detour on my way back. The house on the ridge looked the same, weathered, solid. The study still smelled faintly of old paper and dust.
I sat at my grandfather's desk and opened the bottom drawer, now empty except for copies I'd kept for record. The original folders were archived properly, preserved in a way that honored what they represented. I didn't linger. The house had done its job. So had I. On my last evening there, Rosa invited me to a small gathering at the community center. Nothing formal, just food, conversation, the kind of casual togetherness that doesn't announce itself. I declined the attention she tried to give me and sat near the back. People talked about schools, landscaping, summer plans, ordinary things. When someone thanked me, I nodded and redirected. The work had never been about gratitude. It had been about stopping something that shouldn't have been allowed to continue. Driving away the next morning, I understood something clearly for the first time. The real inheritance my grandfather left wasn't the land or the leverage or even the timing. It was the expectation that if you're in a position to stop harm, you do it. Not loudly, not dramatically. You do it carefully, with enough evidence that it can't be undone when you step away. Back in Oregon, life settled into a new normal. Red Mesa became a reference point, not a destination. I kept the door open for calls, answered questions when asked, and otherwise let the community live its own life. That was the measure of success. They didn't need me anymore. Years from now, someone will move into one of those houses without knowing any of this history. They'll walk the trail at sunset, attend a meeting where budgets are debated openly, pay fees they understand, and never feel the pressure that once pushed people out quietly. That's how it should be. Justice that announces itself tends to fade. Justice that embeds itself becomes invisible and then permanent. When people ask me what happened in Arizona, I keep it simple. I say a community learned the truth about the ground it stood on and decided to stand differently afterward. I don't mention names, I don't recount threats, I don't talk about leverage, because the point was never the confrontation. The point was what remained after it was over.
Time passed in the way it always does after something heavy ends. Not with ceremony, but with accumulation. Seasons stacked on top of each other, reports were filed, read, and archived. Names that once carried weight faded into footnotes. Red Mesa Estates stopped being a headline inside my own life and became what it should have been all along, a functioning place where people lived without feeling watched. I knew this not because anyone told me, but because the calls slowed, then stopped. Silence, in this case, meant stability. 2 years after I left Arizona, the first lease anniversary under the new terms came and went without incident. The audit was released on schedule, clean, unremarkable. The board posted it online without fanfare. Attendance at meetings leveled out to normal numbers, not crowds driven by outrage, not rooms emptied by fear. Just residents who showed up when they cared about an issue and stayed home when they didn't. That balance mattered. Extremes are easy to control. Normalcy isn't. Rosa sent me a handwritten letter that spring. She said the road felt like a road again, not a pressure corridor. She said new families had moved into houses that once carried stories no one spoke about. She said children rode bikes past her place without parents glancing over their shoulders. The letter ended with a simple line, "You gave us our quiet back." I didn't reply right away. Gratitude is heavier than anger. It stays longer. I returned to Arizona one final time, not for work, not for meetings, but because I needed to see it without obligation attached. I drove in early, parked near the ridge, and walked the trail alone. The desert was cool, the air thin and clear. From that vantage point, Red Mesa looked ordinary. Rows of houses, streets, trees planted where there had once been scrub. Nothing about it suggested the years of control, manipulation, and silence that had defined it. That was the point. If you do something right, it stops advertising itself. I stood where the fence used to be and tried to remember how it felt to arrive the first time. The exhaustion, the anger, the sense of being pushed before it even had time to stand. It felt distant now, like recalling a storm from inside a solid building. I realized then that my grandfather had understood something I hadn't at first. Power doesn't announce itself when it's most effective. It waits, it observes, and when it moves, it does so with precision, not noise. I visited the house one last time. It was empty now, staged for sale to someone who wanted land, not leverage. I walked through each room slowly, the kitchen where I had held that first citation, the study where everything had changed the moment I opened the wrong drawer. I didn't take anything with me. Memory didn't require souvenirs. The sale closed 6 months later. The land remained under the same terms, protected by the same structures. Ownership shifted, responsibility transferred, but the safeguards stayed. That was the condition I'd insisted on. Stewardship doesn't require permanence, it requires continuity. Back home, my work expanded into areas I hadn't anticipated. Clients sought me out not just for environmental cases, but for disputes involving land trusts, community governance, and disclosure failures. I never advertised what happened in Arizona. Word traveled anyway. Stories like that always do. I told clients the same thing every time. Documents matter, patterns matter, and silence is rarely accidental. Occasionally, someone would ask if I ever regretted not taking everything, not terminating the lease, not forcing an immediate reckoning that would have left me with absolute control. I always answered the same way. Control is temporary. Damage lasts longer. The families living there weren't my adversaries. They were collateral that someone else had been willing to spend. I wasn't. Years from now, when the lease comes up for renewal again, someone else will be in my position. They'll have choices. They'll inherit not just terms, but a history of how those terms were handled when things went wrong. That history will matter more than any clause. Precedent always does. The last update I received from Red Mesa came quietly, buried in a forwarded agenda. The board had approved funding for a small archive project, digitizing community records going back to the subdivision's founding, not because they were required to, but because they wanted a complete record. Transparency became a habit. That was the real victory. I thought about Marjorie once, long after everything was done. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, just curiosity. What happens to someone when the system they built to amplify themselves disappears? The answer didn't matter. Accountability isn't about erasing people. It's about limiting the harm they can do. That had been accomplished. On an evening, years later, I walked a trail near my home in Oregon, not unlike the one in Arizona. The sun dipped low, the light shifting gold and gray. A family passed me, laughing, unguarded. I realized then that places don't remember conflicts the way people do. They remember outcomes. They remember whether boundaries became bridges or stayed locked dates. My grandfather once told me that land outlives everyone who fights over it. The only thing that changes is who gets to decide what it's used for. Standing there, miles from where it all began, I finally understood that the decision itself is the inheritance, not the acres, not the contracts, the choice to act or not, when acting will change more than just your own life. Red Mesa didn't become perfect, no community ever does, but it became honest, and honesty, unlike fear, scales, it spreads quietly. It teaches people how to stand without leaning on someone else's authority. That was enough. What would you do if an HOA stole the land beneath your own home? Would you stay silent? Tell me in the comments. For real HOA stories like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it.